So, I want to start somewhere uncomfortable. Most of the problems people have with their work, their ambition, their confidence, even their sense of meaning, it's not necessarily because they lack discipline or talent or intelligence. It's because they're constantly editing themselves, not just online, internally. There's a version of you that thinks certain thoughts, wants certain things, notices certain patterns, and you've learned to quietly push that version aside because it doesn't fit the image you're trying to maintain. The image society tells you is acceptable. Maybe it's too intense. Maybe it's too competitive. Maybe it wants attention, power, admiration, control, impact, things you were taught to be suspicious of. So you soften it, you dilute it, you intellectualize it. And on paper, that looks like maturity. But internally, something starts to fracture. Carl Jung called this the shadow, not as a metaphor for evil, but as a description of everything you've disowned in yourself because it didn't earn approval. And if you're creative, ambitious, or driven in any way, this matters more than you think, because the shadow doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It waits, and then it leaks. Most people hear embracing the shadow and immediately think it means indulging their worst impulses, like you're supposed to become louder, darker, more aggressive, more chaotic. That's not what this is. The shadow isn't about becoming worse. It's about becoming less divided. Jung wasn't talking about unleashing evil. He was talking about the cost of pretending parts of yourself don't exist. His argument was basically this: the more you identify with the version of yourself that's socially acceptable, the more power you give to the parts you're hiding, because they operate without your awareness. And when something runs without awareness, it runs badly. This matters more now than ever, because modern life trains you to be hyper-aware of how you're perceived. Not who you are, how you look, how you sound, how you come across. You learn to manage optics before you learn to manage yourself. So you become polite, reasonable, emotionally articulate, and quietly hollow. You say the right things. You avoid saying the wrong ones. You learn restraint before you learn honesty. And eventually, you start becoming a shell of who you actually are. That's where the shadow grows. There's a lot of nonsense online about the shadow. People either turn it into a self-help buzzword or something vaguely edgy and aesthetic. Here's how the shadow usually appears. Not in dramatic ways, but subtle ones. You procrastinate because finishing something would force you to confront how much you actually want it to succeed. You criticize people doing what you wish you were brave enough to do, and you call it discernment. You downplay your ambition publicly while privately obsessing over outcomes. You tell yourself you're content while constantly distracting yourself. None of that makes you bad. It makes you split. The shadow isn't some mysterious inner monster. It's just all the traits you never learned how to carry responsibly. Think about how kids learn. If a child shows curiosity, it gets encouraged. If a child shows anger, it gets corrected. If a child shows competitiveness, it gets warned. If a child shows obsession, it gets labeled unhealthy. So what happens? The encouraged traits get refined. The discouraged ones get hidden. But hidden doesn't mean gone. It means unintegrated. That's why so many adults are oddly passive-aggressive, resentful, insecure about their ambition, or uncomfortable owning what they actually want. They weren't taught how to handle these traits. They were just taught how to suppress them. Aggression that was never trained becomes resentment. Desire that was never owned becomes compulsion. Ambition that was never integrated becomes self-sabotage. And if you're creative, this shows up in your work immediately. Your art becomes hesitant. Your voice sounds diluted. Your ideas feel unfinished even when they're polished. Because you're not saying what you actually think, you're saying what survives self-censorship. This is where a lot of people get stuck. They think integrating the shadow means expressing everything, saying whatever comes to mind, dumping emotions into their work, turning honesty into a performance. It's not integration. Integration is not expression without control. It's control without denial. Jung talked about this clearly. The goal isn't to let the shadow run your life. It's to bring it into consciousness so it can be directed. Think of it like this. If you suppress anger, it leaks out passively. If you indulge anger, it burns everything. If you understand anger, it becomes precision. Same with ambition, same with desire, same with competitiveness. The difference between destructive people and effective ones isn't that one has darker impulses and the other doesn't. It's that one pretends they're above them. Creatively, this is the difference between art that feels raw but unfocused and art that feels sharp and inevitable. The second kind comes from someone who knows what they want to say and isn't afraid of the part of themselves saying it. The shadow is closely tied to power, not power in the cartoon villain sense, but influence, impact, control over your direction. A lot of creatives say they just want to express themselves. But if you're honest, you probably want more than that. You want your work to matter. You want people to feel it. You want to move something in the world. That desire gets shamed early. People are told to stay humble, to not take themselves too seriously, to just do it for fun, which is fine until it becomes a way of disowning ambition. Nietzsche talked about this constantly, how people moralize weakness because it's safer than admitting they want strength. So instead of integrating ambition, people pretend they don't have it, and it comes out sideways. They become bitter about other people's success. They criticize loudly while creating little. They act detached while secretly craving recognition. That's the shadow running the show. When you integrate it, something changes. You stop pretending you don't care. You stop needing to posture. You stop sabotaging yourself to stay likable. Your work gets clearer, sharper, more intentional because you're no longer fighting yourself. This is where people expect some dramatic transformation. This is what embracing the shadow actually looks like. It looks like admitting things to yourself without immediately correcting them. I want recognition. I want my work to dominate. I want to be better than most people at this. I get jealous. I like control. Not acting on all of it blindly, just acknowledging it without flinching. When you do that, those traits stop hijacking you. They become energy you can aim. In creativity, that means your work starts reflecting tension instead of perfection. You stop smoothing edges that shouldn't be smooth. You stop explaining yourself so much. You let silence, discomfort, and ambiguity exist. People don't always like that, but they feel it, and feeling is the whole point. Most people will never do this because it requires sitting with parts of yourself that aren't flattering. It requires trading moral comfort for psychological honesty. But if you're serious about creating something that lasts, something that feels alive, there's no other route. The shadow isn't your enemy. It's the part of you that never learned how to speak without being punished. Give it language, give it structure, give it a place in your work. And suddenly, you're not trying to be interesting anymore. You just are.